At first glance, it sounds like nonsense, a contradiction. How can someone find themselves by first becoming lost? Isn't the whole point of life to discover who we are, not to let go of it? And yet, across cultures, time periods, and disciplines, the same idea echoes again and again. From ancient Buddhist monks to modern psychoanalysts, from Christian mystics to existential philosophers, the message remains the same. The ego must die so that the true self can emerge. But what does it actually mean to lose your ego? And why do so many of the greatest minds in history describe this process as the key to truth, freedom, and inner peace? We're going to explore that question. We'll look at what the ego really is, not just in spiritual terms, but psychological ones. We'll see how we build our identities, why we cling to them, and how this attachment might be the very thing that keeps us from growing. Because maybe, just maybe, the person you think you are is the very thing holding you back from becoming who you're meant to be. To understand why losing the ego is so powerful, we first need to understand what the ego actually is. In psychological terms, the ego isn't inherently bad. It's not your pride, arrogance, or vanity, although those can be its side effects. For Freud, the ego was the mediator, the part of the mind that balances the raw instincts of the ID with the moral constraints of the superego. It's the part of you that deals with reality, making decisions, setting goals, and managing your behavior in the world. Carl Jung saw the ego differently. For him, the ego was your conscious identity, the part of the psyche you are aware of. It's your sense of I, your name, your story, your preferences, your roles, all bundled into one narrative you call me. And in many ways, this ego is incredibly useful. It helps us function. It helps us maintain stability in a chaotic world. Without an ego, you couldn't set boundaries, make plans, or even hold a conversation. But here's the problem. We mistake the ego for the whole self. The ego is like a mask, a persona we wear to fit into society. It's the role we play at work, with our family, on social media, even in our own heads. And over time, we become so identified with that role that we forget it's not who we truly are. It's just who we think we need to be. And that's where the limitation comes in. The ego resists change. It fears uncertainty. It clings to old stories about who you are, even when those stories make you miserable. Because it would rather feel safe and in control than face the unknown. So the question becomes, what lies beneath the mask? What happens when we stop playing the role and start exploring the self behind it? What if everything you think you are, your name, your personality, your memories, is just an illusion? It's a radical idea, but not a new one. In Buddhism, there is the concept of anatta, the doctrine of no self. According to this view, there is no permanent, unchanging self at the core of our being. What we call the self is actually a fluid, ever-shifting process. A bundle of sensations, thoughts, and perceptions constantly arising and fading away. And the more we cling to this illusion of a fixed identity, the more we suffer. Because life itself is impermanent. Everything changes. And when we try to hold on to who we think we are, we create resistance, pain, confusion. The Scottish philosopher David Hume reached a similar conclusion centuries later. When he looked inward, he didn't find a solid self, just a bundle of perceptions passing through consciousness. There was no thinker behind the thoughts, just thought. Alan Watts, the British philosopher and spiritual teacher, put it more poetically. The ego is nothing more than a symbol of yourself, just as a map is not the territory. He argued that we are not separate entities trapped inside our skin, but rather expressions of the universe itself, like waves on the surface of the ocean. But the ego doesn't see it that way. The ego creates a sense of separateness, a hard boundary between me and the world. It divides reality into subject and object, self and other, creating the illusion that we are isolated fragments struggling against the rest of existence. And it's in this illusion, this feeling of being cut off from the whole, that most of our anxiety, loneliness, and existential confusion arises. So the deeper question isn't, who am I? It's, is there even an I to begin with? The ego doesn't just create an illusion. It creates a prison. Because once you've built an identity, the ego's primary job becomes protecting it. And that's where the fear begins. The ego fears change, because change threatens its narrative. It fears rejection, because it sees validation as survival. And it fears the unknown, because in the unknown, it loses control. That fear shows up everywhere. It's the reason you stay in a job that drains you, because your title gives you a sense of worth. It's the reason you hold on to relationships that no longer feel alive, because being a good partner or a loyal friend has become part of who you believe you are. It's the reason you can't admit when you're wrong, because the ego would rather be right than be free. At its core, the ego is addicted to three things: control, recognition, and superiority. It wants to feel like it's in charge. It wants to be seen, admired, applauded. It wants to feel better than others, or at least not worse. And whenever those desires are threatened, the ego panics. It reacts, it lashes out, or it shuts down completely. But here's the quiet tragedy. The more tightly we cling to who we think we are, the more we suffer. Because life will change. You will lose things. You will fail, grow, age, be misunderstood. And every time reality collides with the ego's expectations, there's pain. So much of our suffering comes not from life itself, but from the ego's refusal to let go. Ego death is not a poetic metaphor. It feels like dying. When the ego collapses, it's not just an idea that breaks. It's your entire sense of self. The stories you've told about who you are, what you want, what matters. They begin to fall apart. And in that moment, something terrifying happens. You don't know who you are anymore. For many, ego death is triggered by intense experiences: trauma, loss, deep meditation, near-death experiences, psychedelic journeys, or what mystics have long called a dark night of the soul. And when it comes, it's not peaceful. It's disorienting. It's overwhelming. It can feel like madness, as if the ground beneath your identity has been ripped away. You, as you knew yourself, begin to dissolve. You may feel like you're watching your life from the outside, as if none of it belongs to you anymore. You may grieve the person you used to be, or panic as you realize you no longer believe the things you once held sacred. And yet, paradoxically, there's something underneath that doesn't die. Something raw, still, unshaped by roles or labels. A quiet awareness, a presence, a kind of freedom that doesn't need definition. Many who experience ego death describe it as both the most terrifying and most liberating moment of their lives. Because in letting go of who you thought you were, you uncover something deeper, something more real than the persona you spent years constructing. Ego death isn't the end of you. It's the end of the illusion, and the beginning of something far more honest. So, what's left when the ego dies? Not nothing, but everything you overlooked. What remains is stillness, presence, a quiet, watchful awareness that doesn't need to prove itself, defend itself, or define itself. You're no longer performing a role. You're simply there, fully, honestly, without needing to be anything other than what you are in this moment. In Jungian psychology, this is the emergence of the self. Not the ego, not the mask, but the totality of who you are. The conscious and the unconscious, the light and the shadow, the parts you show to the world, and the parts you've buried deep within. The capital S self is not a role you play. It's a deeper wholeness that can only be discovered when the ego finally steps aside. This is the rebirth. And it doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. A shift in perception, a feeling of peace where there used to be tension, a softening of the need to be someone. You begin to live differently. You listen more, react less. You let go of needing to win every argument, be the smartest, or always appear put together. You no longer cling to identity, because you've realized that your essence isn't in your resume, your followers, or your self-image. It's in your awareness, your presence, your ability to witness life as it is. You're not lost, you're finally whole. And ironically, only by losing your ego did you find your true self. Ego death sounds liberating, even enlightening. But the truth is, most people will never willingly go through it. Why? Because it's painful, deeply uncomfortable. It feels like annihilation, like letting go of everything you thought made you, you. And for the ego, that's indistinguishable from actual death. We fear the loss of identity more than almost anything. We fear not knowing who we are. We fear stepping into the unknown without a script. And society doesn't make it any easier. From the moment we're born, we're taught to build an ego, to construct an identity, polish it, and protect it at all costs. Success is measured in titles, possessions, achievements, and image. We're constantly encouraged to curate ourselves, to be someone, and to look like we know who we are. But what if that very process is the trap? Because the more you build up the ego, the more fragile it becomes, the more defensive, reactive, and afraid of change. And eventually, personal growth hits a wall. You can't move forward because you're too busy trying to hold yourself together. Without ego death, or at least ego surrender, transformation remains surface level. You might change habits, change jobs, change relationships, but the core of you stays the same. And sometimes the only way forward is through collapse. It's in the letting go of control, of certainty, of the need to be somebody that true growth begins. So if the ego is what's holding us back, how do we begin to let it go? The truth is, ego death doesn't always happen in one dramatic, life-shattering moment. More often, it unfolds slowly, in quiet choices, in uncomfortable truths, in the courage to see yourself clearly. There are practices that gently dissolve the ego over time. Meditation, where you learn to observe thoughts without clinging to them. Deep introspection, where you question your assumptions, your motives, your story. Shadow work, the difficult but essential task of confronting the parts of yourself you've hidden or denied. Psychedelics, in carefully guided, intentional settings, have shown the ability to temporarily shatter the ego, though they're not a shortcut and not without risk. And perhaps most importantly, surrender. Not as weakness, but as a conscious choice to stop resisting life. But ego shedding isn't always found in spiritual practices or altered states. Sometimes it happens in the simplest of moments, when you admit you were wrong, when you tell the truth, even if it costs you something, when you let someone else be seen instead of needing the spotlight, when you enter the unknown without needing to feel in control. These are the cracks in the armor. And through those cracks, something deeper begins to emerge. Not a better version of your ego, but a quieter, freer sense of being. Letting go isn't about losing who you are. It's about discovering who you were before the ego told you who to be. You must lose yourself to find yourself. By now, maybe that contradiction doesn't seem so strange. Maybe it's the most honest thing you've heard in a long time. Because the ego isn't who you are. It's who you think you have to be. A mask, a performance, a fragile construction trying to keep everything in place. But beneath that mask, there's something real. When you begin to let go, not just of your image, but of your need to be someone, you don't become less. You become whole. You stop chasing approval, perfection, power, and instead begin to experience life with a new kind of clarity. It's not easy. The death of the ego can feel like falling apart. But in that falling, there's a freedom the ego could never give you. A freedom to feel without filters, to love without fear, to exist without needing to justify yourself. So maybe the person you've been trying so hard to become is the person you've always been, quietly waiting beneath the ego.